Imagine risking everything, your family name, your future, your identity, just to make one choice your own. He thought marrying the driver's daughter would free him from an arranged marriage. Instead, it set him on a journey he never expected. A journey that redefined love, loyalty, and the meaning of dignity. From the moment he was old enough to understand his family's expectations, he felt the invisible weight of tradition pressing on his shoulders. His relatives often spoke about honor, reputation, and legacy, as though these concepts were living beings that needed constant feeding. Decisions were rarely about personal wishes. They were about what the world would think, what society would approve, what the family elders would nod at with satisfaction. He grew up in a household where choices were predetermined and obedience was equated with respect. The idea of questioning any of this was nearly unthinkable, and yet, somewhere deep inside him, a quiet rebellion was always simmering. He knew he was expected to conform, but he could never silence the voice inside that whispered, "This is not your path." His parents, especially, had painted a picture of his future years before he had even learned to make his own decisions. They believed in tradition so strongly that personal happiness often became secondary. To them, marriage was not a union between two souls. It was a merger between two families, a strategic alliance that maintained their social status. Every conversation at home eventually found its way back to that predetermined future. Reminders of the girl chosen for him, her family's standing, their shared values, and how perfectly she aligned with the family's vision. He would hear phrases like, "This is for your own good," or "We know what is best for you," and each time, the walls around him seemed to close in a little more. He felt trapped not by people he disliked, but by people he loved, people who could not understand why their vision for his life suffocated him. With every passing day, the pressure intensified. His cousins, already married through perfectly curated arrangements, became examples held up to him. His aunts and uncles repeated the same script he had heard since childhood, praising obedience and criticizing those who dared to go against tradition. Even his friends, who were raised in similar environments, could not fully grasp the turmoil he felt. Some told him to accept what was expected of him, to avoid conflict, to honor his parents by sacrificing his own wishes. Others told him to run away from it all, but no one understood the complexity of what he felt, the tug-of-war between loyalty to his family and loyalty to himself. This internal battle was slowly eroding him from within. He wasn't simply being asked to marry someone, he was being asked to surrender the control of his entire life. What made it worse was the way his family framed everything as a matter of love. They insisted, genuinely and repeatedly, that their decisions came from a place of care. They believed they were protecting him from heartbreak, uncertainty, and disappointment. They were convinced that tradition guaranteed stability, and stability guaranteed happiness. He could see the sincerity in their eyes, and that sincerity made the pressure even more unbearable. He didn't want to hurt them. He didn't want to be the reason for conflict or disappointment. Yet, he couldn't ignore the truth. Living a life chosen for him felt like a slow emotional suffocation. Each time his mother mentioned the upcoming engagement, he felt his chest tighten. Each time his father spoke proudly about the marriage plans, he felt himself drifting further away from the person he wanted to become. His struggle was not merely emotional, it was psychological. He would lie awake at night thinking about the consequences of obeying versus disobeying. If he followed their wishes, he would maintain peace and honor, but lose himself. If he rebelled, he would regain his freedom, but lose the approval of the very people who raised him. It was a dilemma that tore him apart. He began to feel like a spectator in his own life, watching decisions being made for him without his consent. He wondered whether tradition was supposed to guide a person or imprison them. The fear of losing control over his future became stronger than the fear of disappointing his family. And yet he kept silent, hoping things would somehow resolve themselves, a hope that grew weaker each day as the date of the arranged engagement approached. As the pressure mounted, he found himself becoming increasingly isolated. He stopped sharing his thoughts with his friends and distanced himself from his family to avoid constant discussions about marriage. He began spending more time alone, trying to understand why his heart resisted so strongly. Deep down, he knew that he was not ready to sacrifice his autonomy for the sake of tradition. He believed love should be chosen, not assigned. He believed that a life lived under constant obligation would eventually turn into resentment. And yet, every attempt to express this to his family was dismissed as immaturity or selfishness. They could not see that he was fighting a battle within himself, trying to reconcile the values he had been raised with and the identity he wished to build. The pressure of tradition, unyielding and relentless, became the very force that pushed him toward a decision that would change his life forever. A decision he made not out of love or clarity, but out of desperation to reclaim ownership of his own destiny. The decision to escape did not come to him in one sudden burst. It built up slowly, like water rising behind a dam that was never meant to hold so much pressure. Each conversation about his engagement tightened the tension inside him. Each reminder about the perfect girl chosen for him pushed him closer to the edge. He felt like an actor forced into a script he had never auditioned for. Though he tried to suppress the growing panic, it eventually became impossible to ignore. One day, after yet another heated discussion with his parents about wedding dates and guest lists, he walked out of the house with no real destination in mind, just a burning need to breathe, to think, to be away from the invisible hands trying to mold his life. In that moment, his desperation was so intense that even the most irrational escape seemed better than the suffocating certainty waiting at home. That was when the idea first entered his mind, reckless, unpolished, and fueled by pure emotion. He remembered the driver's daughter, a quiet and humble young woman who often stayed out of sight, absorbed in her studies and daily chores. She represented the complete opposite of the world his parents were trying to force on him. She was not chosen by society, not wrapped in expectations, not packaged in the superficial standards of social status. She was simply there, ordinary, unnoticed, and untouched by the pressures that surrounded him. At first, the thought of marrying her startled him. It sounded absurd, like a plot twist in a poorly written drama. But the more he thought about it, the more it began to feel like the only path left, a drastic step that would shatter every plan his family had built for him, and in doing so, finally free him. The idea consumed him for days. He knew it was irrational, he knew it was unfair, to her, to himself, and even to his family. But when a person feels cornered, logic becomes irrelevant, fear becomes fuel. He convinced himself that this was the only way to take back control of his life. Running away didn't feel like an option. It would bring shame upon his family. Confronting them would end in emotional turmoil he didn't have the strength to endure. But marrying someone entirely outside their approved circle, that would force them to relinquish their plans. In his mind, it became the perfect escape, a rebellious move that would cut him free from the chains of obligation. He told himself that once the storm passed, things would settle, and he could rebuild his life on his own terms. The day he acted on his decision, his heart raced with a mix of fear and adrenaline. He approached the driver first, politely but with a seriousness that caught the older man off guard. Then he asked to speak with the daughter alone. She was shocked when he told her what he intended. The proposal did not come wrapped in romance or affection. It was raw, rushed, and riddled with desperation. She asked him why more than once, and each time his answer was vague, almost evasive. But she saw the truth in his eyes. He was drowning, and he believed she was the only lifeline that could pull him to the surface. She hesitated, confused and overwhelmed, but also deeply aware that rejecting him might push him toward a darker, more irreversible path. Against her instincts, she agreed, not out of love, but out of compassion, caution, and the weight of circumstances neither of them fully controlled. The small, sudden ceremony happened so quietly that it felt unreal. There were no guests, no celebrations, no laughter. Just the two of them standing side by side, bound by a decision neither had fully processed. When it was done, he felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. He had escaped the arranged marriage, but in doing so, he had stepped into a life entirely unknown, unpredictable, and drastically different from anything he had ever imagined. There was no turning back now. He knew his family would react with shock, anger, and disappointment. He braced himself for the storm he had triggered, knowing that the consequences would be severe. But for the first time in months, he also felt a flicker of freedom. Thin, fragile, but undeniably real. Yet even in that moment of escape, he could not shake the awareness of the enormity of what he had done. He had altered not only his path, but hers as well. She had stepped into a life that would test her strength and resilience in ways she had never expected. As they walked away from the courthouse together, the air felt heavy with unspoken truths and unanswered questions. He had escaped the marriage he feared, but now stood face with the consequences of a choice made not with clarity, but with desperation. And although he had finally taken control of his destiny, he had no idea what awaited him next. In the first days after the marriage, he began to see the world through a lens he had never used before. Growing up in privilege, he had always believed himself to be open-minded, fair, and respectful toward everyone. But once the noise of rebellion settled, he started to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. He had married the driver's daughter impulsively, without fully considering her feelings or the consequences she would face. Deep inside, he realized he hadn't seen her as an equal, just as an escape route. That realization stung. It forced him to acknowledge that, despite believing he was different from the elitist mindset around him, he carried many of the same unconscious biases. He had never thought of her dreams, her desires, her fears. She had simply been a solution. Now, sharing a home with her, he could no longer hide from this truth. In the beginning, small details exposed the divide between them. The way she moved quietly around the house, careful not to take up space, made him uneasy. Not because she was doing anything wrong, but because it highlighted how much her upbringing had taught her to shrink herself. She apologized too often, avoided eye contact, and hesitated before speaking, as if waiting for permission. It bothered him, not out of irritation, but guilt. He began to realize how easily society conditioned people to believe they were inferior. And worse, how privileged people like him unconsciously accepted the benefits of such conditioning without ever questioning it. He saw his own privilege reflected in the contrast between them, and for the first time, it didn't feel like something to be proud of. He also noticed how others treated her. Strangers looked at her differently with assumptions and quiet judgments. Some people whispered, some stared, and some openly questioned their relationship. He found himself growing angry not at her, but at the world that labeled her so quickly, based solely on her status. Yet, ironically, this anger brought him back to an uncomfortable memory. Before all of this happened, he might have judged her the same way. Not out of cruelty, but out of upbringing. The class divide had been so deeply ingrained in him that he never thought to challenge it. Until now, when its harshness was directed at someone beside him. The shame he felt was heavy, but necessary. It pushed him to reflect on how blind he had been to the privileges he enjoyed without effort. As days passed, he began to see sides of her he had never noticed during his hurried visits at home. She was intelligent, quietly so. She observed things before speaking, understood situations quickly, and had an emotional maturity beyond her age. She had dreams she had never shared with anyone, ambitions she didn't feel worthy enough to pursue, and a strength she kept hidden out of habit. Each conversation revealed layers he had never bothered to look for. Slowly, he realized that his prejudices had not only blinded him to her worth, but had also caused him to underestimate her entirely. She had lived a life far tougher than his, navigating challenges he had never imagined. Her resilience made his own struggles seem smaller in comparison. But the hardest prejudice to confront was the one within himself, the silent belief that his background made him more capable, more deserving, more knowledgeable. That belief had shaped his thinking for years without him ever recognizing it. Living with her, sharing the same uncertainties, starting from scratch together, he began to understand that strength didn't come from status. It came from how one handled adversity. She faced judgment and hardship with grace, while he often struggled with anger and frustration. It was humbling. It made him realize that he had much more to learn from her than she ever needed to learn from him. And for the first time, he started seeing her not as someone beneath him, but as someone beside him, an equal. As he confronted these truths, a shift began within him. His world, expanded. The walls built by upbringing, class, and social conditioning started to crack. He no longer saw her as the driver's daughter, a label that had once defined her in his mind. Instead, he saw her as a human being with depth, dignity, dreams, and strengths that society had failed to acknowledge. This inner transformation didn't happen overnight. It was messy, emotional, and filled with uncomfortable realizations. But it was real, and it marked the beginning of his journey toward becoming a better version of himself, someone capable of love, respect, and equality, someone worthy of the woman he had married, even if he had married her for the wrong reasons. He had expected her to be overwhelmed by the sudden marriage, perhaps even frightened by the drastic change in her life. But instead of collapsing under the pressure, she displayed a quiet strength that surprised him from the very beginning. When his family reacted with shock and fury, she didn't cry or panic. She stood there with her hands folded, her eyes lowered not in fear, but in dignity. She did not respond to harsh words with bitterness, nor did she defend herself unnecessarily. Her calmness contrasted sharply with the chaos around them. He watched her in amazement, realizing that she possessed a resilience he had never noticed before, an inner steadiness that did not crumble even when the world was tilted against her. It was in those first moments of turmoil that he began to see her not as a fragile victim of his decision, but as someone far stronger than he had ever imagined. Despite stepping into a life that offered her no comfort, she adapted with remarkable grace. When they moved into a small, rented space, nothing like the spacious home he had grown up in, she didn't complain about the lack of luxury or the sudden shift in lifestyle. Instead, she went about organizing their home, turning the plain rooms into a place that felt warm and livable. She made do with whatever little they had, using creativity instead of resources. She cooked, cleaned, and managed their finances carefully, ensuring every rupee was spent wisely. Her ability to bring order to unfamiliar chaos humbled him. He had always taken convenience for granted. She, however, knew how to build comfort out of scarcity. Watching her, he realized that true strength wasn't loud or forceful. Sometimes it was in the quiet acceptance of hardship and the determination to rise above it. Her strength showed in her character as well. She didn't hold grudges, not against him for dragging her into an unplanned marriage, nor against his family for rejecting her. When he apologized for the impulsiveness of his decision, she simply nodded and said, "What's done is done. Now we move forward." She did not dwell on what she had lost, the familiar surroundings of her father's home, the security of her predictable routine, or the simplicity of her former life. She focused on what lay ahead, even though the future was uncertain. Her ability to forgive so easily left him shaken. He realized she had every right to resent him, yet she chose patience over anger, understanding over accusation. It was a level of emotional maturity he had never seen in the privileged circles he grew up in. What impressed him even more was her intellectual depth. One evening, he found her studying with intense concentration. He didn't know she had paused her education because of financial constraints. When he asked why she had never mentioned her academic ambitions, she simply said, "There was no point dreaming about something we couldn't afford." The honesty in her voice, without any trace of self-pity, struck him deeply. He had grown up in a world where dreams were encouraged, funded, and celebrated. For her, dreams required courage, because they carried the risk of disappointment. Yet she had them. She wanted to study further, to build a career, to stand on her own feet. Her ambition was not fueled by pride, but by a quiet determination to improve herself. Suddenly, he realized she had a vision for her future, something he had never bothered to ask about before. Her emotional strength became even more evident as they navigated financial challenges. The savings he had were limited, and his parents had cut him off entirely. There were days of frustration, days when he doubted his own decisions, days when the weight of responsibility felt too heavy. But she always remained steady. When he lost hope, she reassured him. When he felt angry or helpless, she listened calmly and reminded him that difficulties were temporary. She didn't let fear dictate her actions. Instead, she encouraged him to search for work, to rebuild himself independently, to grow beyond the shadows of his privileged upbringing. She didn't pamper his weaknesses, she helped him face them. And in doing so, she revealed a strength far greater than anything he had expected from someone society dismissed as just the driver's daughter. Her unexpected strength didn't just surprise him, it inspired him. It forced him to rethink his ideas about class, worth, and capability. He realized that society had underestimated her, but he had too. And now, every day brought forward a new facet of her strength, whether it was her resilience, her kindness, her intelligence, or her unwavering ability to find hope in the darkest days. She had stepped into his life without preparation, without support, and without guarantees. Yet, she confronted every challenge with a courage he had never seen in anyone before. It made him question who truly needed saving, her or him. And as he watched her face the world with quiet determination, he understood something profound. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones the world never bothers to notice. The announcement of their sudden marriage struck his family like a lightning bolt, sharp, unforgiving, and impossible to ignore. He had always known they would react strongly, but he had underestimated the depth of their disappointment and anger. The house that once felt warm and familiar suddenly felt hostile, filled with heavy silence and accusing gazes. His parents refused to acknowledge his wife, insisting that he had humiliated them by choosing beneath his status. They could not understand or accept how he could throw away a carefully planned future for what they saw as a reckless act. Every conversation quickly escalated into arguments. They accused him of betraying the family, of destroying their reputation, of choosing pride over tradition. Nothing, he said, made any difference. For the first time in his life, he realized how conditional their acceptance could be. The consequences grew harsher with each passing day. His father cut him off financially, declaring that if he insisted on living like a common man, then he should learn to survive like one. His mother refused to speak to him at all, choosing tears over words, which hurt him even more deeply. Relatives who once praised him suddenly distanced themselves, as if his decision were contagious. Invitations stopped, calls stopped. The family's social circle whispered behind closed doors, and some didn't even bother to hide their judgment. He felt the sting of those whispers every time he stepped outside. For someone raised in privilege, the sudden shift from comfort to rejection was overwhelming. Yet, he knew he could not back away now. What was done was irreversible. Still, the emotional fallout tugged at him every day, making him question whether he had made a mistake. Even though he didn't regret escaping the arranged marriage, what shocked him more than his family's reaction, however, was how their anger was directed not only at him, but at her. Someone who had done nothing wrong. His family treated her like an intruder, a threat, an inconvenience. They didn't speak to her directly, but the coldness in their eyes said enough. She was blamed for manipulating him, trapping him, corrupting him, even though she had neither sought nor wanted such chaos. She faced their hostility with quiet patience, never complaining, never retaliating, never showing resentment. But he saw the hurt in her eyes, the pain she tried so hard to hide. It infuriated him that the people who had preached values like kindness and respect all his life suddenly abandoned those principles the moment their pride was wounded. As the fallout grew, they eventually had no choice but to leave the house. Moving out was not just a physical separation. It was a symbolic uprooting, a painful acknowledgement that he no longer belonged in the world he once considered home. Walking away with just a few belongings felt surreal. The world outside looked different, colder, harsher. In that moment, he realized how deeply accustomed he had been to privilege, how dependent he had been on the system built around him. The sudden exposure to reality was jarring. Yet, what surprised him was the calm presence beside him. She did not panic or break down. Instead, she stood by him with unwavering steadiness, reminding him gently that new beginnings often came disguised as endings. Their new life brought challenges he had never imagined. Bills, rent, groceries, things he had never once thought about, became daily worries. His parents' silence and disapproval haunted him, especially late at night when doubts crept in. There were moments when guilt overwhelmed him, guilt for causing his wife emotional pain, guilt for hurting his parents, guilt for disrupting the peace of everyone involved. But she remained his anchor. She reassured him that healing would happen in time, that people reacted out of fear and pride, that anger often softened into acceptance eventually. Her ability to stay compassionate toward the very people who blamed her amazed him. She did not let their hostility turn her bitter. Instead, she treated the situation with emotional maturity that far exceeded her circumstances. What stood out through all of this was her refusal to let the fallout define her. Even when his family dismissed her, she continued treating them with respect. When relatives spread rumors, she stayed silent rather than adding fuel to the fire. When neighbors gossiped, she held her head high. Her dignity in the face of humiliation taught him more than any moral lesson he had ever heard. The fallout from his family had been painful, overwhelming, and life-changing. But it also revealed the true character of the woman he had married. She had walked into a storm she didn't create, yet managed to stand tall while the world tried to pull her down. And though he didn't realize it fully at the time, this period of turmoil would eventually become the turning point in his understanding of loyalty, love, and courage. In the beginning, he hadn't expected love to grow between them at all. The marriage had been an escape, a desperate act, not a romantic union. But as days unfolded into weeks and weeks stretched into months, something shifted quietly, almost imperceptibly at first. Living under the same roof, sharing the same struggles, facing the world together, these moments softened the space between them. He began to notice small things that he had been too emotionally blinded to see before. The way she brewed tea exactly the way he liked it without ever being asked. The way she listened attentively when he spoke about his worries. The way she carried hope even when circumstances grew harder. Her presence slowly became the constant comfort he didn't know he needed. And though neither of them openly acknowledged it, there was a growing warmth in the air, a gentle tenderness that didn't ask for recognition but quietly transformed their bond. One of the biggest catalysts for this transformation was the way she believed in him even when he did not believe in himself. After losing his financial support and struggling to adapt to a life without privilege, he went through phases of frustration, self-doubt, and even shame. There were days he felt like a failure, unworthy of her patience and kindness, but she saw potential where he saw weakness. She encouraged him to pursue opportunities he would have once dismissed as beneath him. She reminded him that dignity came not from wealth, but from effort. Her faith in him was steady and unwavering, a kind of support he had never experienced before, not from friends, not from extended family, not even from his parents, who had always expected success rather than nurtured it. Her belief became the anchor that stopped him from drowning in despair. As time passed, he found himself drawn to her strength and honesty. She had no pretense, no desire to impress, no masks to hide behind. Her simplicity wasn't plainness, it was clarity. She expressed emotions without manipulation, spoke truth without cruelty, and carried herself with a blend of humility and quiet pride that felt rare in a world obsessed with status. He began to admire her openly. Conversations between them grew deeper, filled with shared dreams, childhood memories, and hopes for the future. He learned that she loved to read poetry, enjoyed the rain, and wanted to become a teacher someday. She learned about his fears, his ambitions, and his desire to someday prove, not to society but to himself, that he could stand on his own. These exchanges created a sense of closeness that didn't need dramatic declarations. It simply grew naturally, like a flame that burned steady and bright. The transformation also showed in how he began treating her. At first, he carried guilt. Guilt for dragging her into a marriage she didn't choose. Guilt for exposing her to hostility. Guilt for the life she had to leave behind. But gradually, guilt gave way to admiration. Admiration to affection. And affection to a protective tenderness he had never experienced. He found joy in small gestures, helping her with chores, surprising her with her favorite snacks when they could afford it, walking her to the bus stop so she wouldn't feel unsafe. These weren't grand romantic gestures, but everyday acts that slowly stitched them closer. He began to see her not as someone he owed something to, but as someone he genuinely wanted to build a life with, a partner, not a burden. What surprised him most was how love changed him from within. He became more patient, more thoughtful, more grounded. The arrogance that privilege had once nurtured started melting away, replaced by humility. He no longer measured worth by status. He learned to value resilience over reputation, character over wealth, effort over labels. She taught him, without ever intending to, that love wasn't about perfection or appearances. It was about sincerity, respect, and shared growth. Each challenge they overcame together deepened his emotional maturity. And though their life was still far from perfect, every hardship brought them closer rather than driving them apart. Love wasn't dramatic or cinematic for them. It was steady, consistent, and quietly transformative. Little by little, he realized that the marriage he had once viewed as a desperate escape had become the foundation of his personal growth. The woman he had married in haste had become the reason he wanted to become a better man. Her presence had softened his anger, strengthened his resolve, and given purpose to the struggles they faced. And though he hadn't planned for love, hadn't sought it, hadn't even believed he deserved it, it found him regardless, gently reshaping his life, his values, and his heart in ways he could never have predicted. As he stood at the crossroads of the life he had always known and the life he had built from nothing, he finally understood the meaning of destiny, not the one written by others, but the one shaped by courage, humility, and choice. He looked at the woman beside him, the one he had once married out of desperation, and realized she had become the very heart of his existence. The world had judged her, dismissed her, and underestimated her, but she had proven stronger than all their expectations, stronger even than he had ever imagined strength could be. Slowly, his family began to see the changes in him. They saw a son who had grown wiser, kinder, and more grounded. They saw a man who no longer hid behind privilege, but stood firmly on his own feet. And they saw the woman who had inspired that transformation, steady, respectful, and full of quiet grace. Pride can soften, wounds can heal, and hearts can learn what eyes once refused to see. Eventually, the walls between them began to crack, not through confrontation, but through time, patience, and undeniable truth. One evening, as he walked home from work, tired yet content, he realized something he had never understood before. He had set out to escape an arranged marriage, believing he was running from a life he didn't want. But life had brought him to the place he truly belonged. What began as an act of rebellion had become the greatest blessing he could have asked for. He had not expected love. He had not expected growth. He had not expected her. And yet, she became the reason he learned to stand, to fight, to change, and to hope. He married the driver's daughter to escape an arranged marriage, but what he found instead was a partner, a purpose, and a love that didn't just change his life. It changed him.